At 2825 Saratoga Trail in Frederick, Colorado, Chris Watts, a 33-year-old oil field operator, and Shannon Watts, a 34-year-old health and wellness entrepreneur, lived with their two daughters, Bella, 4, and Celeste, 3. Shannon was also 15 weeks pregnant with their son, Nico. From the outside, their lives appeared perfect. Chris had a steady job, and Shannon's thriving business provided financial growth. Shannon frequently shared glimpses of their family life on social media, painting a picture of joy and love. But beneath the surface, tensions grew. What unfolded next would turn their dream home into a site of unimaginable tragedy. This is the story of how love, betrayal, and hidden secrets culminated in one of the most chilling family tragedies in recent history: the Watts family murders. In the small town of Frederick, Colorado, the Watts family lived what appeared to be a perfect life. Chris Watts, a 33-year-old father, and his wife, Shannon, a 34-year-old mother of 2, had seemingly built a life full of promise. Together, they had 2 beautiful young daughters, Bella, aged 4, and Celeste, or Cece, aged 3. The family was well known in their community, with Shannon active in social media, often sharing happy moments of their family life on Facebook. Chris was quiet, reserved, and loving, while Shannon was the outgoing, confident one who worked tirelessly to support her direct sales business, Thrive. Chris worked as an operator for an oil and gas company. He spent long hours away from home, and while his job paid well, it kept him distant from his family. Shannon, on the other hand, was ambitious and focused on her business, which she balanced with her responsibilities as a mother. Despite their busy schedules, Shannon and Chris appeared to be a solid couple, deeply in love and committed to one another. But this outwardly picture-perfect family was not as it seemed. Behind the scenes, cracks were starting to form in their relationship. Chris had grown emotionally distant from Shannon, a shift that didn't go unnoticed by her. Their once strong connection had weakened, and despite Shannon's efforts to reconnect, Chris seemed to pull further away, a change she struggled to understand. She was unsure why her husband had become so emotionally detached, but she assumed it was a result of the pressures they faced in their financial and family lives. Shannon, though frustrated by the distance she felt, continued to stay optimistic. She believed that things would improve, especially with the birth of their 3rd child, a son they planned to name Nico. But as the days passed, Chris's emotional withdrawal continued, creating an invisible chasm between them that neither could cross. Despite their troubles, Shannon loved her family deeply. She threw herself into her work, trying to maintain a sense of normalcy in the home, even as Chris seemed to become more preoccupied with his own struggles. Unbeknownst to her, the distance that Chris had created was about to be filled by someone else. While Shannon was working hard to maintain a sense of normalcy in her family, Chris Watts was hiding a dark secret. In the spring of 2018, Chris had begun a secret affair with a woman named Nicole Kessinger. Nicole, a 30-year-old woman who worked at the same company as Chris, had met him through work. Their relationship began innocently enough, but it quickly turned into something far more complicated. Nicole was captivated by Chris's quiet demeanor, and he was drawn to her confidence. They exchanged text messages, phone calls, and began meeting in secret, keeping their relationship hidden from their spouses. Chris and Nicole would spend hours texting, sharing intimate details of their lives, and even discussing their dreams for a future together. Chris painted a picture of a man trapped in an unhappy marriage, telling Nicole that he and Shannon were no longer connected emotionally. He even spoke of the impending separation, claiming that he would be getting a divorce soon. Nicole, for her part, believed Chris's story. She had no reason to question his words, and the affair quickly became a major part of her life. They met up several times, and Nicole began to believe that Chris was genuinely unhappy and that they had a future together. Chris, on the other hand, was growing more emotionally invested in Nicole, but he was also overwhelmed by guilt and confusion. His emotional connection with Shannon had already been severed, but he had not yet brought himself to confront her about their deteriorating relationship. Instead, He chose to hide behind the affair, hoping that somehow it would give him the courage to make a decision. Chris's double life continued for several months, and the affair with Nickel became the center of his world. At home, he was distant and cold, while with Nickel, he found solace and excitement. But the guilt weighed heavily on him, and his marriage to Shannon was deteriorating at an alarming rate. As the summer of 2018 approached, the tensions within the Watts family were reaching their peak. Shannon, though still in love with her husband, was growing increasingly frustrated with Chris's emotional detachment. She began to notice the changes in his behavior, the late nights, the secretive phone calls, and the way he seemed to withdraw from her both physically and emotionally. Yet, Shannon was determined to make their marriage work, still holding on to the belief that they could overcome their challenges together. Shannon's growing sense of unease was compounded by the stresses of her life. She was facing financial pressures due to her business ventures, and she was trying to maintain a sense of balance for the sake of her children. Chris, however, seemed uninterested in resolving their issues. The emotional distance between them had become a chasm, and it was clear that their relationship was on the brink of collapse. As the days passed, Chris's feelings of guilt and shame over his affair with Nickel began to consume him. He felt torn between the two women, the life he had built with Shannon and their two young daughters, and the new life he dreamed of with Nickel. At times, Chris would talk to Nickel about how unhappy he was in his marriage, and how he was desperate to get out of it. But despite these confessions, Chris remained trapped. He didn't know how to leave Shannon without destroying his family, yet his desire to be with Nickel was overpowering. In the meantime, Shannon, oblivious to Chris's affair, continued to work on her business and focus on her family. She was unaware of the emotional turmoil that Chris was experiencing, and she had no idea that his mind had already been made up. As Chris became more entrenched in his secret life, Shannon's attempts to bridge the growing gap between them became more desperate. But it seemed like nothing could reach him anymore. The emotional walls he had built around himself were too high, and he had already begun to plan a devastating escape. The morning of August 13, 2018, began like any other day for the Watts family. Shannon, having returned from a business trip to Arizona the previous evening, was preparing to leave again, this time for a planned trip to North Carolina. She was tired but determined to keep everything moving forward. Chris, who had been distant for weeks, seemed detached as he went about his morning routine. What Shannon didn't know, however, was that her husband's mind had already been made up, and his decision was irrevocable. Chris's emotional disconnect had turned into something darker. For months, he had fantasized about his life with Nickel, imagining a future without the responsibilities of being a husband and father. But he couldn't face Shannon, couldn't tell her that he no longer wanted to be married. Instead, he chose a different, horrific path. On that fateful morning, after Shannon had left for an appointment and Chris was alone in the house with his daughters, Bella and Cece, he made the decision that would end their lives. The tension had been building for months. The lies, the guilt, the emotional strain, but it all came to a head on this tragic day. Shannon, unaware of the danger that awaited her, went about her business, posting a final photo on Facebook before she left. In the photo, she was smiling, enjoying a meal with a friend. It was a stark contrast to the horrific events that were unfolding at home. As Shannon returned home later that morning, she walked into a home that would soon become a crime scene. She had no idea that Chris had already made the most monstrous decision a man could make. As Chris looked at his wife, who had always been so devoted to him and their family, he saw only a barrier between him and his future with Nickel. The connection to his wife had long since evaporated, and what followed would be the result of months of hidden rage, guilt, and a desire to escape his reality. On the morning of August 13, 2018, Shannon Watts was about to experience the last moments of her life. After a quick conversation with Chris, she went upstairs to lie down for a short rest. Chris, meanwhile, was in a state of cold determination. His decision had been made, and there was no turning back. The emotional toll of the affair, the guilt, and the desire for a new life had built up to a breaking point. He needed to erase the family he had once built. It began with Shannon. Chris strangled her to death in their bedroom, taking her life in a horrifying act of violence. Bella and Cece, still unaware of the unfolding nightmare, were in their rooms, playing and unaware of what was about to happen to them. Chris, driven by a desire to start over, did not spare his daughters. He loaded their small, lifeless bodies into his truck and took them to a remote location where he worked, an oil field near a site known as the Anadarko Petroleum Company. At this oil field, where Chris had spent much of his workdays, he disposed of their bodies. Bella and Cece were smothered, their lives extinguished with no mercy. Chris, in a final act of cold calculation, discarded their bodies in the tanks at the site, before returning to the family home to clean up the horrific scene. Shannon's body was also placed in a shallow grave at the same site. It was a heinous act, one that shocked the entire nation and left a community grappling with disbelief. Chris, who had once been seen as a loving father and husband, had become a monster, driven by guilt, desperation, and the overwhelming desire to start a new life with Nickel. In the hours that followed, Chris's attempts to cover up the crime would quickly unravel. When Shannon did not show up for her North Carolina trip, friends and family grew concerned. It wasn't like her to leave without a word. Her friends, worried for her safety, reached out to the authorities, and soon a search was underway. What they would discover would leave them in shock. A man they thought they knew was capable of the most unimaginable act. Later that day, authorities arrived at the Watts family home. Chris, who had reported Shannon and the children missing, was now under intense scrutiny. His behavior was odd and his responses seemed rehearsed. Detectives quickly noticed inconsistencies in his statements. Chris had claimed that his wife had simply vanished, and that he was unaware of what had happened to her or their daughters. But as investigators delved deeper into the case, they began to uncover shocking details. Chris's affair with Nickel Kessinger had been discovered, and his emotional detachment from his family became more evident. His lies began to unravel, and his story about the events of August 13th fell apart under scrutiny. In one of the most chilling moments of the investigation, Chris's demeanor shifted. He went from being cooperative to defensive as the detectives pressed him for details. The authorities, piecing together evidence and witness testimony, began to build their case. The house was searched thoroughly, and forensic evidence began to surface, revealing the horror that had taken place. Chris's movements on the day of the murders were tracked, and security footage from his workplace revealed his truck at the oil site, where his daughters' bodies were found. The final piece of the puzzle came when Chris, realizing the evidence was overwhelming, finally confessed. He admitted to the brutal murders of his wife and children, explaining that he had killed Shannon in a fit of rage, and then smothered Bella and Cece to prevent them from witnessing what he had done. His confession was chilling and left investigators, as well as the public, in shock. The man they had known, the father, the husband, was capable of unimaginable cruelty. As the investigation continued, the full extent of Chris's lies and deceit came to light. The affair, the emotional detachment, and the coldness with which he ended the lives of his family were laid bare for the world to see. His motives, driven by guilt, desire, and desperation, had led to a devastating and irreversible tragedy. The murders of Shannon, Bella, and Cece Watts rocked the nation. What had once been a family full of promise was now a horrific crime scene, a reminder of the dangers of lies, emotional distance, and unchecked desire. Chris Watts, the man who had once appeared to have it all, now stood as a convicted murderer. In November of 2018, Chris Watts pled guilty to the murders of his wife and children. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a sentence that seemed insufficient in light of the brutality of his crimes. The shock of the case reverberated across the globe, leaving many wondering how someone who appeared so normal could commit such a monstrous act. The affair, the lies, and the emotional disconnection had set the stage for a tragedy that no one could have anticipated. As for Nickel Kessinger, she was left to grapple with the reality of the role she had unwittingly played in the events that led to the murders. Her relationship with Chris had been built on lies, and she was forever marked by her connection to the tragedy. In the aftermath, she was given a new identity and has largely remained out of the public eye. The Watts case remains one of the most haunting true crime stories of modern times, a chilling reminder of how secrets, lies, and unaddressed emotional turmoil can spiral into a tragedy that affects not just one family, but an entire community. The trial of Chris Watts was an inevitable step in bringing justice to the victims. After his confession, the world was waiting for the legal process to unfold. In November of 2018, Chris pled guilty to the murders of his wife, Shanann, and their daughters, Bella and Celeste. The decision to enter a plea deal and avoid the death penalty was a strategic one, made by his defense team. While the families of the victims hoped for some measure of closure, the decision to spare him from the death penalty was met with mixed emotions. The courtroom was a place of raw emotion. Family members of Shanann, Bella, and Cece gathered, their grief palpable as they faced the man responsible for the murders of their loved ones. The prosecution laid out the gruesome details of the crime, recounting the chilling nature of the killings. Shanann's family, in particular, was determined to see justice done. During the proceedings, they spoke out, detailing how Shanann had been a loving mother, a devoted wife, and a hard-working woman. Her family had lost everything because of Chris's betrayal. The defense, on the other hand, tried to explain the emotional state Chris was in at the time of the murders. They highlighted his troubled relationship with Shanann and his desire to be with Nicole, whom he had been having an affair with for months. They argued that he had committed the crime out of a sense of desperation and a desire to escape his life. But despite their attempts, it was clear to the jury, the prosecution, and the public that Chris's actions were premeditated and deliberate. The case was not just a legal battle. It was a psychological examination of a man whose mind had shattered under the pressure of guilt, infidelity, and his own desires. Chris, who had once appeared to be a loving and hard-working family man, was revealed as someone who harbored dark secrets. The court had to reckon with the fact that a man could go from being a family man to a cold-blooded killer, all because of lies and deceit. The trial brought with it an outpouring of grief from Shanann's family, who spoke of their love for her and their pain at the loss of two beautiful children. The loss was immeasurable, and nothing could ever bring the family back together. Shanann's mother, Frank Rzusek, often spoke at length about his daughter's life and how much he missed her. His impact on the courtroom was profound, as he gave voice to the tragedy that had befallen his family. Chris Watts sat silently, facing the consequences of his actions, his once promising life now reduced to a courtroom drama filled with pain and suffering. The trial ultimately ended with Chris receiving a life sentence without the possibility of parole. He was ordered to serve his sentence in a maximum security prison in Wisconsin. The judge's ruling reflected the cruelty of the crime: 3 lives taken by a man who was once seen as a loving husband and father. The consequences were clear. Chris Watts would never walk free again. This chapter of the Watts family's tragedy was now a legal matter. But for Shanann's family and the community left behind, it was only the beginning of a lifetime of mourning and healing. No legal sentence could ever erase the pain that Chris's actions had caused. The Watts family murders have left an indelible mark on both the local community in Colorado and the world at large. While the legal battle is over, the emotional scars remain. Shanann's family, friends, and the public continue to grapple with the sheer brutality of the crime and the loss of a vibrant woman and her 2 young daughters. The media's coverage of the case has made it one of the most talked-about true crime stories of the 21st century, with documentaries, podcasts, and news stories documenting every grim detail. In the months following the murders, Shanann's family continued to speak out about their loss. Her father, Frank Rzusek, in particular, became a voice for justice. Through his pain, he called for greater awareness of domestic abuse and the importance of supporting those who may be struggling in toxic relationships. Shanann's life, cut tragically short, was remembered through the outpouring of support from her friends and community. Her social media accounts became a testament to the woman she had been before the tragedy, a loving mother, friend, and advocate for health and wellness. The surviving members of Shanann's family, including her parents and siblings, worked tirelessly to keep her memory alive. They founded the Shannon Watts Memorial Fund and supported causes related to domestic violence awareness and children's welfare. Their mission was to honor Shannon's legacy and ensure that her children's memories lived on in a world that could never forget the horror of their untimely deaths. Chris Watts, now imprisoned for life, will live the remainder of his years in solitary confinement, far removed from the life he once had. He will never experience the world he had hoped for with Nicole Kessinger, the woman who played a role in the breakdown of his marriage. As for Nicole, she has since disappeared from the public eye, having made it clear that she wants to live a life far away from the tragedy she was involuntarily connected to. The Watts family tragedy was a culmination of hidden lies, a dysfunctional marriage, and the emotional breakdown of a man who felt trapped in his own life. The murder of Shannon, Bella, and Cece was not just an isolated act of violence. It was the result of deep emotional turmoil and years of manipulation, secrecy, and deceit. The shockwaves from the case have reverberated across the world, prompting many to reconsider the complexities of domestic life and the importance of understanding the emotional health of those we love. Shannon Watts, her children, and their story continue to serve as a stark reminder of the dangers of emotional neglect, infidelity, and the devastating consequences they can have on the people closest to us. The Watts family tragedy is a harrowing tale of betrayal, violence, and the unraveling of a seemingly perfect family. It serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of hidden emotional turmoil, unchecked desires, and the deadly consequences of manipulation and deceit. Through the pain of Shannon's family and the public's reaction, the case highlighted the need for greater awareness of domestic violence and the devastating impact it can have on individuals and communities.